Hello everyone and welcome to my session for the Scottish Summit 2021. My name's Sam Cogan and today we're going to be talking a bit about Azure Active Directory. Just a quick thank you to all our sponsors for today. Without this event would be very difficult to put on, so big thank you. Hopefully you'll go and check them out. As I mentioned, my name's Sam Cogan and I'm a solutions architect for a company called Willis Towers Watson based in the UK, and I'm also a Microsoft Azure MVP. I spend a lot of time working with Azure, both in my day job and as part of the community work I do, and so you'll find a lot of information from me both on Twitter at Sam Cogan and on my blog at samcogan.com. If you're interested in finding out more, please do go and check those out. So today we're going to talk about Azure Active Directory, and we're going to talk about this in the context of something that will be very useful for somebody who's coming to Azure for the first time, somebody who's been working with Azure for a while but wants to take a look at some of the identity space, and someone who's perhaps coming from a on-premise background and is having to look to migrate to Azure and see how it all works. Hopefully what we talk about today will be useful to you. And in particular, what we're going to talk about is the fact that Azure Active Directory is not Active Directory. I like to think that when somebody in Microsoft's marketing department came up with the name Azure Active Directory, they were feeling pretty smug with themselves. They were quite happy that it was a recognizable name, that people who were coming to Azure would understand what Active Directory was, and so they'll understand what Azure Active Directory was. And the problem is that people did, and people still do. So anyone who has had experience with Active Directory will know what it does. We will understand how it works with users, groups, machines, organizational units, all those sort of things. And so it's not an uncommon view to come to Azure for the first time and see Azure Active Directory and make the assumption that, well, this must be the cloud-based, Active Directory as a service. And that's not an invalid assumption to make, but it's wrong. So Azure Active Directory is very far removed from Active Directory. And in my view, to be honest, it would have been better if it had a different name when it was created to avoid some of this confusion. So Azure Active Directory is not Active Directory. It has a couple of similarities which we'll look at, and at a very, very high level it deals with identity, but it does so in a very different way to what you're used to on-premise with Active Directory. And so this can be a bit of a blocker for people coming to this for the first time, or who are coming in with assumptions that, unfortunately, through no fault of their own, are incorrect. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to have a look at what Azure Active Directory is, what it does, what it differs from Active Directory, and what it can't do. And once we've gone through that, we'll then dig into a quick demo, see how it works, and then we will look at some other options that you can work with Azure Active Directory to perhaps get some of the areas and the services that you're missing from Active Directory back, or to have alternatives that might be more useful in this new cloud-based world. So let's get started. So as I mentioned, when you come to Azure Active Directory for the first time, if you're coming from an assumption that it's cloud-based Active Directory, then the questions on here are things that you'll probably have running through your head. And I know I did, and I know people I've talked to who've started working with Azure Active Directory have wondered these sort of things. So if you're assuming it's like Active Directory, then you'll assume that, well, I can join machines to this. It's just a domain. I can join machines. I can manage computer objects. Where do I do that? Most of the time when you deploy Active Directory, you're deploying with Windows DNS as well, so they integrate together, and you've got your integrated AD DNS zones. So where's DNS? It's not in Azure Active Directory. What about if I need to do LDAP queries? Well, I've got applications that need to talk LDAP or even NTLM. That doesn't exist. And what about group policy? How do I manage my users and their computers and apply policies? Well, that's not part of Azure Active Directory either. So these are all things that can be very confusing when you first start looking at Azure Active Directory, or AAD, as I'll probably refer to it as we go forward. And it can be very confusing. So that then begs the question, well, if it can't do all of these things, what does it do? So Azure Active Directory is a what you might call a modern identity provider. So it has broken away from what was in Active Directory, and it is really designed for providing identities to work with modern authentication and identity. So things like OAuth, things like SAML to some extent. All those modern authentication protocols that are working with today's web-based applications and SaaS services and so on. So what Azure Active Directory is providing you first and foremost is an identity store. You can create users, and so in this way it's not too dissimilar from Active Directory. You can create users in Active Directory as well, but your users in Azure Active Directory are designed to be used with modern authentication like OAuth, SAML and so on. To provide your users with access to things like Office 365, SaaS solutions like Salesforce, for example. Alongside that, it's an application identity store. And this goes two ways. So firstly, it allows you to store identities of applications to which your users are going to have access. So if you are bringing in third-party applications like Office 365, Salesforce, Dropbox, all those modern applications that you can authenticate with OAuth and so on, you can use Azure Active Directory to store their application details and provide access to users. But on the other side of the coin, if you're an application creator and you want to be able to actually offer your applications to users who again are using these modern authentication protocols, then you can use Azure Active Directory as a way for you to house your application's identity and to offer it to other users who want to come and use your application. Primarily that will be other users who've got Azure Active Directory themselves, but there are also ways to branch out and look at other identity providers talking to Azure Active Directory, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But those are the two really key areas that Azure Active Directory provides usage for. So users and application identity. As I mentioned, that's all around modern authentications. There's no LDAP and no NTLM here. It's all around OAuth, SAML, all those sort of things. That's the core. On top of that, we have layered a number of other services, and we'll dig a bit deeper into this a bit later, but just to call out a few of these. Firstly, AAD offers some identity protection. So, as the central store for all your application and user identity, it's able to sort of look at your identities, look at the logs, look at who's logging in where and so on, and provide you with some information and some protection around those users being compromised, those applications being compromised and so on. And so it does offer some services. There are different levels of services, which we'll talk about in a minute, and you may want to pay additional for some of those services, but there is identity protection built into Azure Active Directory. Another key area is the use of AAD for collaboration. And this has been built in from the get-go, really, because as we'll see, AAD not only performs a function for identity in terms of using Azure, but it is also the core of how identity works with Office 365. So if you create an Office 365 environment, you will get an Azure AD tenant behind the scenes. Now, you might not know that because if you never touch the actual Azure AD piece, you can do most of the management through Office 365. But what's behind the scenes is Azure Active Directory. And it's there because it's a way for you to actually provision your company's users access, but it also forms the core of how any collaboration works in Office 365. So if you need to share documents or work with teams with people outside of your company, then what you end up doing is you use some of the B2B collaboration features in Azure AD to invite users from other tenants and to allow them to actually access your resources and so on. And it's worth calling out there that, so I used the word tenant there, and you'll hear me probably refer to that quite a lot through this session. So a tenant is is basically an Azure Active Directory instance. So it contains all of your users, and that would be what Microsoft refer to as a tenant. So when we're talking about looking at guest users and people from other tenants, that's other companies with their own Azure AD instance. But yeah, so collaboration is built in with the B2B collaboration piece, allowing you to invite users from other tenants. There's also the aspect of multi-tenant applications. So when you create an application that you want to share with the world, you can make that a multi-tenant application and allow users to sign in from other tenants that you are offering the service to. I mentioned this is mainly focused around users with coming from their own Azure AD tenants, but if you do want to invite users from outside of that, so people who've got identities from maybe Google identities or Outlook.com or so on, there is the concept of Azure AD B2C, so business to consumer. We won't really be digging into that today, but it does exist. It's a separate sort of service that sits on top of Azure AD, and if you're looking at B2C type stuff, you might want to look at that. So just a few examples here of what you might want to use Azure AD for. So the most common ones, you've got users, you want to give them access to SaaS applications. That might be Office 365, that might be third-party applications. If they support Azure Active Directory, then you can create your users in your tenant, you can enable access to the application, and they can just log in with their identity that they know. They're not having to create an identity at the third party. This is your identity store, and you can grant them access. You can also remove their access when they leave. You've got control over that, so it's your centralized identity store for access to modern applications. You can also extend that. Most applications will allow you to assign different roles to different users, and you can use Azure Active Directory to do that, either by assigning users to specific roles, or there is a concept of groups in Azure Active Directory, and you can then grant roles and access to groups and put users in groups and so on, which will be familiar to anyone who's worked with Active Directory. As I already mentioned, you can work with applications. You can either consume applications. So if you sign up for Office 365, then you will have an Office 365 application created in your tenant. You can grant your users access and you can manage that application. And if you decide you don't want it anymore, you can remove access. You have that control through application consumption. But you can also publish applications for other people to consume. And there's a whole raft of things you can do with that around how you secure those applications, the type of protocols you allow access, and so on. And then lastly, you can look at sharing your resources. So you can grant access to other users from other tenants to access your say Office 365 resources, or you can be invited to actually access things in their tenant. So as an MVP, one of the common things I get to do is I get to attend sessions with Microsoft about products and so on. And what they do there is they invite my identity into the Microsoft tenant so that I can access Teams and SharePoint and so on to access those resources. Now, I mentioned before that not everything here is available in the free version or the base versions. There are 4 versions of Azure Active Directory that you can look at. So when you create an Azure Active Directory instance using Azure, then you get the free version. And so the free version contains the basic stuff that we've talked about already. So you can create users, you can create groups, you can create and consume applications. You can also look at some level of device registration. So you can join devices, both PCs and mobile devices, to Azure Active Directory in a very different way to how it works with Active Directory. And you can do some management of devices through Azure AD. It's fairly limited just to be able to enable and disable those devices access. You can use Azure AD Connect, which we'll talk about in a bit in the hybrid world, which allows you to synchronize users from Active Directory on your on-premise environment to Azure Active Directory. You can use self-service password change, or SSPC, for cloud users. So you can have an interface for your users who are created in Azure Active Directory to come in and change their password. This is for users who actually know their password and want to reset it. It's not a password reset function, which is another feature that's offered in a paid version. This is a password change, and it's only for cloud users, so users that have to be created in Azure Active Directory. If they were synced from on-prem using AD Connect, you don't have that option. And then I mentioned you've got Azure AD domain join there, so you can join your machines to Azure Active Directory. If, on the other hand, you created your AAD tenant when you signed up for Office 365, you actually get a different tier with a few extra features. Mainly this is around custom branding, so you can go in and change the logos and the text and stuff for when you sign into Azure AD. You get self-service password reset for cloud users, so not only can they change it if they know it, but if they've forgotten their password, they can change it through the web UI here, again, for cloud-only users. And you get an SLA. So the free version doesn't have an SLA, and that's because it's free. Microsoft obviously can't offer you monetary compensation for downtime if you've not actually paid anything in the first place. Whereas with Office 365, you are paying a fee, so there is an SLA. The free version does have a sort of expected uptime, but there's no monetary backing for that. Then on the last two tiers, the premium SKU are the paid for tiers. And there's a P1 and a P2, and they go up in price. So the P1 tier is about £4 to £5 a month, and the premium P2 I think is around somewhere between £6 and £7 a month. You can look up those prices in the Office portal. And these offer additional features above the previous tiers. And this is where you get some of the more complicated features and potentially more useful features if you're looking particularly from either a security perspective or a collaboration perspective. So things like password protection. So you get the ability in the P1 tier to have things like checking against a list of known bad passwords when somebody tries to change the password. So some quite useful tools to try and make people more secure. You get self-service password reset for non-cloud users. So cloud users, so users that were created in your AD tenant, you can reset them through AAD and it will sync back to on-prem. You get group access management, and this one is really annoying that it's in the P1 tier, to be honest, in my opinion. So if you want to assign access to Azure AD applications by assigning a group, you have to have the P1 tier. Otherwise, you have to do it individually for each user. I don't really agree with that one, but that's where it is. You get some other tools like Application Proxy, which allows you to expose on-prem applications through AAD. To the outside world. You get Connect Health for monitoring your Azure Active Directory instance. You get some advanced features around groups like dynamic groups, which can be quite useful. And you get conditional access. Now this one is something that if you're an enterprise and you're letting your users access third-party applications, might be a deal breaker, might be the reason why you need P1. So conditional access allows you to actually say apply policies to applications that say the user can only access this application from a company joined machine or only from certain locations or only if they use multi-factor authentication and so on. So those are all in the P1 tier. In P2 you then get access to some further information, primarily again around security. And so this is things like risky account detection, so it will use some machine learning to actually understand what your users are doing, where the logins are, and try and pick out risky logins where the users logged in from one location and then half an hour later is logged in from somewhere thousands of miles away, things like that. You can have it apply conditional access based on risk. So this machine learning, if it decides it is a risky login, it can apply conditional access and say you must have MFA or so on. And then there's some tooling around privileged identity. So the privileged identity management tooling. This allows you to do things like access reviews, so to check who's got access to what and perform an audit. And it allows you to do just-in-time elevation. So if you want to have your users come along and they want to, maybe you're giving them administrator access or owner access to something in Azure, but you only want them to do that when they need it, you can use PIM to grant them that right, but they have to elevate to it when they need it. That'll all be logged, and you can even add things like an actual authorization step, so somebody else has to approve their access. You can send out an email to make sure people know that they've validated, and you can restrict how long they can have that role, and so on. So PIMs are quite a useful tool if you want to have that sort of just-in-time access. So those are the different tiers, and you can choose obviously which one you want and whether you want to pay for them or not. Okay, so we're going to have a quick demo now, just to have a quick look at what Azure AD looks like if you've never seen it before. So this is my Azure AD tenant, and once you get to this through the Azure portal, and this is the free tenant. I don't have any P1 or P2 licenses applied at the moment, but it's been configured for my users. It's got a custom domain enabled so that all my users can be added with the samcogan.com suffix, and you can see the basic sort of information and use that we're going to get. The first thing here is we've got our users, so we can see that you've got configured my users for my tenant in here, and I can go into those users and I can manage that user, so I can assign them roles to actually manage Azure AD if I want them to be administrator. I can add them to groups, I can grant them access to applications, I can assign licenses and devices to them, and I can even actually look at things like authentication methods, and I can reset their password, require that they use multi-factor authentication, and so on. I can also see some information here about where these users have signed in from. So I can see what applications they've signed into, where they've come from, and the sort of the location and so on. I've got groups, and groups function in a very similar way to what you might expect from Active Directory. I can just create a group and I can put some users in it. I can assign owners to the group so people can actually manage that, and you can apply those groups to applications and even role assignments if you have those P1 licenses. Then I've got applications, and there are two places here to register. There's app registrations and enterprise applications. I won't go into them that really today, but there is a difference here between a normal application and something like an enterprise app that has SAML-based authentication and those sort of things. But if we have a look at my app registrations, I'll have a look at all applications, and you can see here these are some applications that I've created. There's quite a lot in here actually, but these are applications that I've used, created myself for actually publishing applications to the outside world and so on. If we have a look in enterprise applications, you can see I've both got those applications I created, but also I've got some third-party applications. So this is where I can sign up to applications from third parties like Azure DevOps, Draw.io, conference previously I was at, and those sort of things, Office 365. And I can come in and manage access to those applications if I want to. Now generally something like Office 365 I would do that through the Office portal, but I can see what users are assigned to this and who's the owner and those sort of things. And I could apply a conditional access policy to this if I wanted to control how users accessed the Exchange Online. Again, I don't have a P1 license, so I'm not using that. There's some device management in here, so you can see the devices I've got that have actually been either joined to Azure AD or registered to it. So there's a difference here between one that's actually domain joined, so when I log on to that application, that device, I use my Azure AD credentials, and when I actually register it, this is where I've got applications running on that machine like Office 365 that are using my Azure AD identity, but the machine's not actually joined. And then you've got a load of other things you can do, like Azure AD Connect, application proxy, you can customize domain names, password reset, branding, all those sort of things that you can use if you're in the right tier. We won't delve into too much into those. If you're interested, there are lots and lots of documentation on how you can take advantage of those sort of features. So we've talked about what Active Directory is. Let's talk a little bit about what it's not. So it is not Active Directory. Azure Active Directory, as we said, is very different. It has a similar premise, then it looks after identity, but it is focused around users, groups, and applications. So there's no group policy. There's no way to actually apply policies to your users and machines to have them configured in a certain way when they log on to machines. There are tools we can look at in the future that will do some of that, but when you use Azure Active Directory out of the box, it does not have a group policy in it. It doesn't have domain join and machine management in the same way as Active Directory. We have seen you can Azure AD join a machine. All that's really doing is allowing you to log on to that machine with your Azure AD identity. All of the other information, like having computer objects you can grant permissions to and things like that, don't exist in the same way as Active Directory. All of the old protocols are gone. There's no LDAP, there's no NTLM, there's no Kerberos. It's all about modern authentication protocols like OAuth, SAML, and so on. So don't expect to be able to do LDAP queries or things like that. There's no OUs, there's no forests, and there's no trusts, so all those features don't really exist. There are some sort of analogies to them that might be useful. So there is a newish feature in Active Directory, in Azure Active Directory, called administrative units, which allow you to group your users and groups together in a similar way to OUs. Now they are quite new, hence why this is still on there, and they're not exactly the same, but you can use them in a somewhat similar way. There aren't forests, so an Azure AD infrastructure is a flat infrastructure. There's no different domains and forests within it. You can only have one, and all users belong to that. And there's no trusts in Azure AD. There's no ability to trust another domain in the same way that you would with on-premise AD. Now, obviously, you have got this B2B collaboration piece, which allows you to actually grant users access to your tenant, or you access other tenants, but it functions obviously in a very different way to domain trusts that you might have been familiar with. And finally, there's no extensible schema like there is with AD. Now, there are things you can do that are quite similar. So when you create your applications, you can create application manifests with roles and so on that you can actually edit yourself and create sort of your own metadata. But it's not the same as being able to extend the whole schema. You can't have Exchange or SharePoint work with AD in the same way. You can't extend the schema for like they do. So if you were doing any custom schema attributes, you would need to sort of redesign those to work with users and user claims and roles and those sort of things. So they're quite different. So now we know what Azure Active Directory is and where it differs from AD. We're going to have a look at how you can implement Azure Active Directory and how you can deal with the fact that it is quite different, and what you do with the concepts you still need from Active Directory, and whether any of those can be brought into Azure Active Directory or whether we need to rely on some of the legacy stuff. And there are a few different scenarios we can look at here as to how you implement Azure Active Directory. So the first one is Azure Active Directory only. So you could live in a world where you get rid of everything else and your only identity store is Azure Active Directory. Now the picture here, nice little unicorn, is here because this is a bit of a unicorn thing. It's very, very rare to find a business who's not, maybe some very small businesses, but particularly larger and enterprise businesses that can live with just Azure Active Directory on its own. Most businesses are coming from a legacy of having Active Directory in place already, and so they are using a lot of those features, and they are in need of those features to manage their business. But if you were in a scenario where you are, your company is solely using modern applications, so maybe you're using Office 365 for all of your office workloads, you're using Salesforce, you're using OneDrive for your data storage, all of those things, and you're purely using those cloud-based applications that support modern auth protocols, then in that scenario, potentially you could live in a world where the only thing you had was Azure AD. And you manage all your users through there. Your users are created as cloud users, and users perhaps log on to their machines with Azure AD domain join, and then they access all the cloud applications through that. So that potentially is a scenario if you're coming from a completely green field site, and maybe you've got a limited amount of users or a limited amount of applications you need access to, and you don't, you perhaps don't need all the capabilities of Active Directory. Then maybe you could do that, but it's not very often I see somebody who's in that sort of position. So next up is probably the most common scenario, which is using a hybrid approach where you still maintain your Active Directory on-premise, and then you use Azure AD Connect to synchronize your users up into Azure AD. And so here's a diagram that's got a little bit more detail, about how this works. So your users and devices actually, are accessing cloud-based applications using their their AD identities, which have been synchronized up to Azure AD. So they don't have to use a different set of credentials to access those modern applications. They can just use their same identity, and that will talk to Azure AD. But when they're talking to on-premise applications, maybe they've got some legacy applications, maybe you need to talk to file servers, you need to talk to on-premise DNS, all that sort of stuff, then they're still using their AD users for that. Their machines are joined to your AD domain, and nothing's really changed from an AD perspective. But now you've got the added ability to have those users also in Azure AD and access those Azure AD applications if you need. So this is the hybrid approach, and this is the most common approach I see that most companies take when they've already got an Active Directory presence and they don't want to lose that. Now, even when you've got on-premise AD, there's quite often a scenario where you might want to move some of that capability into the cloud, into Azure, or even into other clouds like AWS and GCP. Because you've got applications that are running in that cloud environment that perhaps maybe you try to lift and shift some legacy applications, or you've got some servers in there that you want to actually have joined to Active Directory and apply group policy to, and so on. Or maybe you just don't want your domain controllers on-prem. Maybe you want to actually run them in the cloud, and either move all of your resources into the cloud, or have something like ExpressRoute, VPN, those sort of things connecting back to your on-premise resources. In that sort of scenario, it's still perfectly valid to create infrastructure as service, so IaaS VMs in the cloud provider of choice, and turn them into domain controllers. They will work exactly the same way as any domain controllers you've got on VMs running on your premises, but now they're running in Azure, so you can then have applications that are running in Azure or other cloud providers talk to those domain controllers locally. If your ExpressRoute or VPN connection goes down, then they've still got access to them, and so on. Yeah, so having IaaS based domain controllers again is another fairly common scenario, and often that's used together with the hybrid approach. So you've got AD Connect syncing to Azure AD for modern applications. You've got IaaS domain controllers in Azure for legacy applications that need AD there, and then you've got your on-prem domain controllers for anything on-prem that you need. So that's a perfectly valid and still used approach. Obviously, it's now still your responsibility to manage those domain controllers and update them. They're just virtual machines, but certainly very doable. A slightly different approach to that scenario is to look at another service that's offered alongside Azure AD, which is Azure AD Domain Services. This has been around for a few years now, and it's basically an add-on for Azure AD where you create some software as a service domain controllers for that Azure AD directory. So it is effectively what we talked about originally, which Azure AD is not, but is an Active Directory domain as a service. And this diagram, which will come up in a second, is a diagram of how that effectively works. So you still have your Azure Active Directory tenant, and you can still do Azure AD Connect to that if you want, if you have your on-prem resources, and they will synchronize up. But then you have this Azure AD Domain Services piece. And what that does behind the scenes is it creates two domain controllers that are attached to Azure Active Directory and reflect your Azure Active Directory domain in them. So if you're synchronizing from on-prem to Azure Active Directory, then your Azure AD Domain Services domain will have the same domain name as your on-prem one and your Azure Active Directory. But don't be fooled by that. That is a completely separate domain that just happens to have the same name and happens to have the same users in it, but those users have been synced from on-premise to Azure Active Directory and then from Azure Active Directory to Azure AD Domain Services. So they're not the same users, it's not the same domain, but it looks very similar. And Azure AD Domain Services then gives you some functionality above and beyond Azure AD that is more like classic AD. So you do get access to things like Azure AD users and groups. You get access to things like group policy. So you can create policies in Azure AD Domain Services that apply to machines that are joined to that Azure AD Domain Services domain. These don't reflect your on-premise policies. They're completely separate. They don't sync between on-prem and AADDS, but you can create policies that apply to machines. And it's really designed as a solution for where you want to lift and shift applications into Azure that need things like LDAP and NTLM and Kerberos. That all works with Azure ADDS. What it isn't designed to be is a replacement for your on-premise domain controllers, which is quite a common conversation I have, is can we use AADDS and can we just rip out our on-prem domain and use this? There are a lot of limitations with Azure AD Domain Services. It's a fairly small deployment. It's only a couple of domain controllers. You have very limited access rights to it. You don't get domain admin. You get admin rights to certain components like users and computers, DNS, group policy, but you don't have full domain admin rights, and there's a limit to what you can do. There is a limit to what you can do with users. So any users that are created in Azure Active Directory or on-prem are synchronized to AADDS, but you can't edit them in AADDS. Their source of truth basically is Azure AD, so if you want to edit them, you have to edit them there. You can create local users in Azure ADDS, it's local to that domain, but they are not ones you can actually sync back again. So it's really focused around having applications that are running in Azure that allow you to consume legacy authentication protocols and group policy, DNS, those sort of things. But it can be a useful tool. Lastly, you can also look at going beyond Azure Active Directory and extending it with other services to try and replicate or replace some of those things you're missing from Active Directory. So you've got your basic Azure AD, and then we can add on extra services. So we talked already about Windows 10 domain join. So maybe you can replace your machine join and management process with Azure AD domain join. It offers less features than the on-prem version, but maybe that's enough for you. We talked about the fact that there's no DNS in Azure AD. So if you need DNS resolution for your resources that are running in your network, then you could look at using Azure DNS, and in particular Azure Private DNS. So you can have that to create a private DNS zone on your network. It can have device write back and all those sort of things enabled on it, but you can use that to provide DNS for your network running in Azure. So now we've got domain join, we've got DNS. We talked about group policy. That doesn't exist, but there are alternatives. So you can look at something like Intune, which allows you to do device management and policy application to both mobile and PC devices. Now this is quite different to group policy. They're certainly, it's not the same sort of thing. There are different policies. There are different ways they work. But maybe Intune is something that you could actually replace your group policy with, and now you don't need that on your on-prem domain controllers anymore. You could also look at some of the file services available in Azure. So if you need file servers to provide SMB access to AD users and then permission them with AD ACLs and those sort of things, then again, you can't do that really natively with machines that are joined to Azure AD and grant Azure AD access, but you can use things like either Azure Files or Azure NetApp files, things that allow you to actually take Azure AD users and translate them into classic SMB ACLs and give them access to those servers. They're a little bit complex to set up sometimes, particularly with Azure Files, but they can be used, and you could replace some of your on-prem file servers with that as well. You could even look at Azure File Sync if you actually needed to synchronize those files down onto machines that are actually running on your on-prem network, but potentially you want to actually have your source of truth and the files managed in Azure Files. So if you take these tools together, you can sort of put them on top of Azure Active Directory and potentially replicate some of the services that you have from AD on-prem. Now, obviously, you need to have a good idea of actually what the services from AD you need. What is it that actually is important to you, and have a look at whether these can be replaced by these services and move you towards a more cloud-based approach. And it may be that's not possible, and it may be that you're very happy with AD and you don't want to get rid of it. In which case, sticking with the hybrid approach, which gives you the best of both worlds, to have users access cloud applications through Azure AD, but on-prem with AD, is absolutely still a valid approach and is one many people take. So it's deciding really what you need from Azure AD, and how you want to access those resources. And so that's really a summary of where we're at with Azure AD. As you can see, hopefully you've realized that it's a very different beast to Active Directory. The naming is really all it has in similarity with AD. It's an identity store, yes, but it's very different, and it has a very different purpose that it's intended for. And if you're looking at coming to Azure and looking at Azure AD and seeing, well, what do we do with this? You need to have a think about what you want to achieve with your identity. If you're going to be having access to cloud-based applications, or you want to publish your own applications, then getting to grips with Azure AD is going to be important for that. But it's not going to replace your on-prem AD unless you start looking at some of the alternatives. And that may not even be something you want to consider, and you maybe want to go down the hybrid approach. But hopefully you can understand what it's for, what you can do with it and what you can't do with it now, and that'll give you a better idea of what you want to do going forward when you start using these tools. And that's it for my session. So that's a very, very hopefully useful summary of what you can do with Azure Active Directory. If you've got any questions, I'm more than happy to pick those up. You can send them to me over Twitter, or put them in the comments on the video when it gets added to YouTube, which will be in about 14 days time. Or you can reach me on my blog at samcogan.com, and again, you can post questions there, or you can have a look at some of my existing articles. I really do hope you found that useful. I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions from the Scottish Summit. There are lots and lots of them to enjoy. And again, hopefully I'll see you again at another conference in the future. Thanks.